Hello, my name is Dr. Michael Glass. I'm the Regional Studies Association's Territorial Chair for the United States. The Regional Studies Association is a learned society concerned with the analysis of regions and regional issues. Through our international membership, we provide an authoritative voice of and network for academics, students, practitioners, and policymakers. You can find out more about the Regional Studies Association, including information on membership, funding opportunities, and events at regionalstudies.org. I'm pleased to present a new installment of our Regionalists on Film series. This introduces you to the work of established and emerging regional scholars and their scholarship. Today, it's my special privilege to introduce to you Dr. John Paul Addie. Professor Addie is Associate Professor in the Urban Studies Institute at Georgia State University's Andrew Young School of Policy Studies. His research focuses on the politics of urban infrastructure to address questions of access, mobility, and justice. And he's also my co-organizer for the Regional Studies Association's research network, NOIR, the Network on Infrastructural Regionalism. JP, welcome.
Good morning. Thanks for having me, Michael.
Oh, welcome. So let's start with the origin story to your work. And can you tell us a little bit about how you first became interested in researching regions and regional development?
Yeah, so I think my interest in regions kind of emerged at the intersection of a couple of things. So firstly, part of my interest in regions emerged from a frustration that emerged with some work that I was doing for my master's thesis, which was a neighborhood-based case study of an inner city community in Cincinnati. And I was looking at questions of gentrification, the neoliberalization of urban governance, and questions of displacement obviously loom at the fore of these types of conversations. And one of the tensions which emerged in doing this work was the battle to maintain a right to stay in place. So thinking about the neighborhood as a space, place-based understanding of what social struggle was about, what we were fighting for in that instance, and the fact that people were being directly or indirectly displaced into the broader metropolitan region in Cincinnati. And once residents left the kind of visceral, immediate spaces of the downtown inner city, it became very hard to think about how you go about providing services, support, infrastructure, and resources for the communities who were really at the heart of the type of work that I wanted to be doing. So I think that the tensions of displacement within metropolitan context suggested that I needed to assume a more metropolitan or regional perspective when I was taking my work forward. The second moment of my emergence as a regionalist, I think, was shaped empirically as a next step here, because I moved to do my PhD in Toronto, and I worked at York University, which not only put me in a large cosmopolitan international city region, but I was based not in the urban core in Toronto, but on the periphery of the city, which was somewhere which existed beyond the urban imaginary of many Torontonians, how we think about the city. But it also put me in a a paradoxical situation where there's a discursive imagined peripherality to where York University is in Toronto, but it's also sitting at the heart of a dynamic emerging city regional environment. And it was somewhere which, if I wanted to get my teeth into Toronto and understand what was happening in a landscape which was somewhat alienating, given its palimpsest of infrastructures and cities and its palimpsest of infrastructures, transportation networks, all this type of stuff, which was very different to how we experienced the central city. I needed to go and adopt a more regional perspective to understand what was going on in this metropolitan area. It was very different from the small college town where I completed my master's. The third piece of the puzzle was the intellectual environment at York. So I was very privileged to get to work with Roger Callan during my time there, who had written extensively on questions of regional governance, regional development in Toronto and elsewhere, and was also at the beginning stage of what turned into a large-scale global comparative study on suburbanism and suburbanization. So that provided a lot of the intellectual foundations that helped me understand the place where I was and gave me the conceptual tools to work through some of the frustrations that I had with a more localized, place-based approach to urban geographic issues and questions of social justice in cities. But I think one of the things which is important about how I think about questions of regionalization is that I have a foot as a regionalist, but I'm also an urbanist. And when I'm thinking about questions of the region, it's always in a multi-scalar dialogue with various other analytical and scalar lenses. So the region itself isn't a superior or independent lens to understand or address questions of urbanization or urban development, but it gives a particular vantage point to ask questions that are embedded within and shaped through a broader kind of interscalar architecture of regional, urban, national state space. And part of this is, I think, the really interesting tensions that emerge in regional conversations between the functional networks of globalized urbanization now, or city regional urbanization, and the limits of the territorial geographies and administrative jurisdictions through which these spaces are governed. So I think my emergence as a regionalist was shaped, I think, very much by the intersection of my research questions, where I was, but also the conceptual architecture and tools that were provided at York University as a place to think about regions and regionalism.
I think the question of the benefits and some of the drawbacks of the regional scale as one of the motivating scales of analysis is something that we can return to later on when we talk about perhaps the future of regional studies. But you mentioned the palimpsest of infrastructures, and that brings us to another question that I had. Obviously, we're working a lot on questions of infrastructure as part of this infrastructure turn into social and policy sciences. From your perspective, could you explain a little bit more about what interests you about infrastructure and how infrastructure and regional studies intersect?
Sure. So I think, on a base level, that infrastructure and regions intersect because regions make and build infrastructure, and regions in turn make and shape regional spaces and regional formations. But what does that mean in practice? Well, the way that I think about this and the way that I approach these types of questions, I think is very much informed by thinking about the relations between infrastructures and regional spaces, and between processes of infrastructuring and processes of regionalization. So some of the work that I've done with Roger Carr, we had a paper where we were thinking about what is the region in practice? And so we're discussing the notion of real existing regionalism as a tension-ridden, contradictory, historically and geographically contingent expression of talk, territory, and technology. So we think about regional space as not a pre-given container in which social phenomena happen, but something which is decidedly produced through discursive arrangements, the ways in which we talk about regional space, our conceptions of the regions of spatialized area, our visions about the future, who is included, who isn't included. But these discursive formations are connected to a certain kind of material territoriality. So regions are spaces, we draw boundaries around them. They are political and theoretical abstractions in a lot of ways. So there's a territoriality here that brings to the fore questions of inclusion and exclusion. And there are tensions here between the discursive formations, the territorial organization and arrangements of the region, and how it's actually lived. So real existing regionalism is lived through a variety of technologies, and these could be material infrastructures like transportation, water networks, so on and so forth. But they're also lived through technologies of power and governance arrangements. So there's ways in which regions govern infrastructure that shape sewage systems, water provision, water governance, transportation infrastructures, but regions are also kind of governed by infrastructures, because infrastructures then kind of interpolates particular political communities, watersheds. So there's jurisdictional, cultural, biogeographical regions which emerge connected to the particular infrastructures that are necessary to reproduce city regional spaces and city regional lives. So one of the things that we're thinking about through the NOIR network is the process of how do we regionalize an infrastructural turn which has been going on in the social and policy sciences. And I think there's two approaches that we're thinking about in this context, picking up on these ideas. The first is thinking about applying a regional perspective to infrastructures. So if we adopt the region as a scalar perspective and as an analytical vantage point, what can this tell us about the production, the governance, the maintenance of infrastructural systems? The second approach is related but somewhat distinct, and that is using infrastructures to understand the production and lived experience of regional space. Again, thinking that the region itself is something that is a social construct. It's not a pre-given territorial arrangement. And the interests of regional actors aren't contained by the kind of the hard and fast boundaries of regional space. Infrastructures produce political constituencies, they compel the production of new governance authorities. So by taking these two vantage points and thinking about the dynamic relations between infrastructures and regionalism, I think we can get a diverse and dynamic discussion going that can bring in a variety of disciplinary perspectives on the production of infrastructural systems and what the region means for this in terms of governance, in terms of the construction of regional spaces, regional imaginaries, and regional ways of living in the contemporary world.
And there's a continual working out of these processes as well. We're recording this interview in 2022 where Build Back Better and federal level infrastructure provision or funding for infrastructure provision is very much in the policy lexicon at the moment. And yet that regional framing for how regions are going to be constructed and reconstructed through that provision of funding, that's still a very open question at the moment, isn't it?
I think absolutely. And this is one of the things why a regional perspective is really interesting, because it grounds a lot of these discussions about infrastructural futures, about building back better in kind of a concrete context. We have to grapple with thorny political conversations that transcend jurisdictional borders and need to bring different communities together around the table and realize some form of political and policy consensus around the provision of infrastructure and what the provision of infrastructure means about the future of particular regions, whether it's a lagging region in the case of Pittsburgh, a growing, booming Sunbelt region like metropolitan Atlanta. These conversations are different, but regionalism and a regional perspective, I think, does a really useful thing in grounding and concretizing these discussions in actually existing debates around the future of cities, future regions themselves.
Now, you mentioned the future. This brings me to a question that I had about some of your interests at the present, which relate to the temporalities of infrastructure, the time dimension. So there's not merely a spatial component to the way that infrastructure works within regions, but also the temporal dimension. Would you care to say a little bit about your thoughts on that at the moment? Yeah,
so I'm trained as an urban geographer, so questions of space are kind of at the forefront of my mind. And it's been one of the things which has been really interesting about the infrastructural turn, is that this has been something which has really kind of foregrounded spatial questions in a important and meaningful way. If we're thinking about infrastructures as more than the staid, engineered, kind of rote background of the urban fabric, your infrastructures are something which are contested, they're political objects, and the ways in which they connect space is a really kind of important conversation to have. But and this is reflected in the standard way in which we talk about infrastructure. It tends to be dealing with space first and thinking about time and temporality of a consequence of these spatial arrangements. A lot of work on network society has foregrounded the importance of space in an era where instantaneous digital connections, ICT technologies, the internet kind of collapse the time needed to link people to get from A to B, to move resources and ideas around an increasingly networked and interconnected planet. But some of the questions that we've been asking about space in the infrastructural turn, we also need to kind of think about posing in relation to time and temporality, which when you start digging into it, opens some really interesting and productive and generative conversations about the nature of regional space, urbanization, and the role of infrastructure itself. Because time is something which is, you kind of paradoxically, ever present, right? It's something that we're all so familiar with, but when you start to unpack it, time and temporality are pretty difficult to actually define and wrap your heads around it. It's a complex set of, it's a complex set of technologies, ways of thinking about social structures, social dynamics, and the organization and experience of the world. So time and temporality, I think, give a really kind of interesting window to think about these connections between cities, regions, and infrastructures. So for example, we can think that infrastructures themselves are spatial products. They exist in space and they connect and network various metropolitan areas together. But they're also always temporal products in a variety of different ways. The materiality of like a road or a rail system is built, it's maintained, but then it's used, attrition wears it down, and it leads to a state of affairs. We need maintenance to upkeep infrastructural systems, keep them ticking over, and eventually they become antiquated and fall into a state of ruin or disrepair. So there's a material lifespan of infrastructure. But if we're thinking about what infrastructure means for the region, there are also temporal imaginaries that shape how we think about regional space and infrastructure's role within the region. So infrastructures, as the work by Nikhil Anand and others have suggested, contains a promise, the idea that infrastructures are a promise made to the future by the present. So we're thinking about what the future of cities and regions is going to be. Infrastructural investments, the idea of building back better, is a temporal idea, because we're thinking about addressing issues of the present, grappling with both the challenges of the past and perhaps with previous presidential administrations in the US, a nostalgic past which doesn't exist, which is shaping how we project our visions about equitable, inclusive, resilient infrastructures and regional spaces into the future. So there's a temporal modality in terms of how we think about infrastructure that goes along with this materiality. And this is shaped by the ways in which we plan and govern infrastructural systems. Strategic plans both cover a certain time frame, but take time to put together, to work through community engagement processes, to do environmental assessments. There's a temporality to this that is abstracted in what we can think about as planning time. So the formal kind of temporal frames through which regional planning and regional governance operates. But at the same time, our regional lives are lived temporally. They're shaped by the seasons, they're shaped by the daily commute, they're shaped by the pulses and flows of the 24-hour city. And so our lived times don't necessarily line up with the broader, longer-term planning temporal trajectories of regional development. And so thinking about time and temporality brings a lot of these kind of multifaceted, differentiated ways of thinking about and experiencing urban and regional space together. And so in a sense, the ways in which the NOIR network has been approaching questions of time is as an interdisciplinary boundary object that can bring technocratic engineered understandings of infrastructure, political, economic analysis around temporal fixes, financialization, amortization costs, these types of things, and the affective experience that we have with infrastructure, how we feel about it, how we understand it, what it represents about ourselves and societies that we want to live in. So I think temporality really gives us an interesting sandbox to bring together a variety of conversations and think about infrastructure, regionalization, urbanization in the way that pulls together the work which has been done by anthropologists around that futures visioning and the lived practices, rhythms of social life that make infrastructural systems possible. Work by people like Seth Schindler and Miguel Canay on infrastructure-led development to bring these types of things into a conversation where they might not necessarily have been happening in the past.
So you've raised a lot of interesting threads today that showcase the breadth of regionalism as a frame for approaching some of society's problems and unfolding dynamics. I wonder if you'd like to take the opportunity now to reflect a little bit on the current state of regional scholarship at large and what you see as the opportunities and challenges for regional scholars to undertake.
Yeah, so I think regional studies at the moment is in a really exciting place. So somebody who's coming from a background in critical urban geography, I think some of the breadth intellectually and geographically that has shaped that type of geographic scholarship is now kind of resonated through regional studies as well. I think over the past 10, 15 years, regional studies as a discipline has become something which is a kind of exciting exploratory field that's open to a variety of different perspectives and different questions. So one of the things that I like about where regional studies is now is that regionalists are increasingly embracing the dynamism, the fluidity, the fuzziness of regional space in ways that push the region as a scale and as an analytical frame forward. So I think there's a lot of conversations that are happening in regional studies now that resonate with urban studies, that resonate with geography, that resonate with sociology in ways which it might not necessarily have done in the past. So there's a lot of dynamic and interesting conversations going on. And part of this is that interdisciplinarity is now opening up in regional studies. This is necessary to tackle grand societal challenges, which are viscerally articulated at the regional scale. And that stepping back, seeing the broader regional picture, seeing how what's happening in the inner city is dialectically and fundamentally connected to what's going on in the urban periphery is something which is profoundly important if we're thinking about redressing the challenges that we're facing in a world that is increasingly shaped by increasing inequality, that's shaped by unsustainable processes of financialization, racialized disparity, and an existential climate crisis. So
yeah, I think that these are things that are both unfolding right now in terms of existing processes and providing a framing for understanding the historic implications of events such as redlining, which you can't understand inner city redlining without looking for the regional or suburban investments in white only communities at the regional periphery.
I think absolutely. You have where does the investment take place? It's not always like a zero-sum game, but if we're thinking about communities that are redlined, if we're drawing boundaries, if we're making spatial abstractions, these don't exist in isolation. That process of drawing a boundary around a particular place is a moment where we're taking a political decision around who is included and excluded in the territorial discursive spaces of the city. We need to understand how these are connected to what is happening in more peripheral spaces. I think redlining is a great example of this. Contemporary dynamics around the suburbanization of race, poverty, working class communities, immigration is also an important arena to think about these types of questions. If we're going to understand the resurgence of a particular mainstream form of urbanism, the walkable city, the 5-minute city, if we want to understand what's necessary, the infrastructures that are necessary to produce these types of bourgeois urban utopias, we need to look at the regional metropolitan systems and structures, housing, transportation, so on and so forth, that enable these places to be produced.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have available to talk with Dr. Addie today, but I'd like to thank him for joining us to share his perspective on regional scholarship. I'd also encourage all of you to learn more about regional studies and the Regional Studies Association at regionalstudies.org. JP, would you care to have the last word today?
Sure, yeah, I think I want to reiterate that call to check out the RSA. I think as a organization, there's a whole lot of conferences, opportunities, networking events that the association puts on that are really great resources, and a particular shout out for the research network grant scheme that the RSA puts together. This was something which has enabled Michael, Jen Nelles and I to forward the network on infrastructural regionalism, which has brought together a bunch of people from around the world thinking about the questions that are emerging at the intersections of infrastructure and regionalization. So definitely go and check that out and think about the types of conversations which are emerging that you want to have at the forefront of where regional studies should be going.
On that excellent note, I'd like to thank you again and have a great day.
Thanks a lot, Michael.